Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to East Central Missouri and the world, and welcome to the James Strong Show podcast, podcast number 138. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for making us a part of your day. I appreciate it. This podcast was recorded on the evening of Thursday, August the 29th, from the James Strong Studios in Western St. Charles County. My guest in studio today, if you go back a long time, not even on the James Strong Show, on the Good Life Show, back around maybe 2012 or so, was it perhaps? We had as guest on the show a couple of times a psychic intuitive, Teresa Romana Powers, and she's back in studio. Welcome.
Thanks for having me back.
I saw your posts on Facebook. I thought, wow, I remember her. She was a great interviewer. You were interesting. You were different. Because psychic intuitive tells me that's somebody who does things that most people don't. And for those of you who never heard the interviews back in 2012, around then, explain to the audience, what is a psychic intuitive, first of all?
That's a great question because it really has a broad scope when it comes to what does that really entail. For myself, I guess the best way that I could describe it is somebody who utilizes their psychic intuitive side to be able to provide guidance, answer questions, clarity, and insights with any situations that people are trying to get a little bit more clarity on in their lives so they can make better choices and decisions and be able to have a little bit more direction that they really want to be able to move forward with.
Now, is this something that you're born with? You learn from friends? You take a course at the community college? I mean, how does one stumble into something like this?
Honestly, I'd have to say probably all of the above.
All right.
Yeah, so you have some individuals that naturally tap into their psychic abilities. It's really something that's really natural to individuals, any human walking around for the most part. Some are going to be able to tap into it and exercise it a little bit more easily than others. Usually we're taught to start to ignore our intuitive side and follow logic. And so that's usually when people are trying to get back into their psychic abilities. That's when they might have to take a course or learn a little bit more by reading online.
So maybe expand on a natural gift that's already there.
Right, absolutely. Just like you have some people who are fantastic singers, they might just naturally be able to carry a tune, but they have
a voice coach.
Right, and then you have others with a voice coach, or, they can sing along great in the car, but other individuals who might need a little bit more training. So it really depends on the individual, and I always emphasize learning how you already work, starting from that strength and foundation, and then building upon it.
How did you know that you had this gift to begin with?
Well, I have to admit I didn't know because I thought it was all very normal until a lot of different experiences that I would have. And when I would share them with either family or friends, they might kind of freak out and leave me hanging and be like, well, that's not normal. And that's when I started to realize, wait a minute, so you guys aren't seeing some of these same things that I'm seeing. Or, you don't have dreams about everybody else's situations. They're like, no.
What did you see that others didn't see? Be specific, please.
Right. So there was an experience when I was younger, and this is when we lived in North Dakota. And there was a house that was actually a little bit more of a duplex style house. And our room actually shared one of the doors that would access that other part, the other apartment, I guess you would say.
And how old were you when this happened?
I was about 5.
Okay, so you were a young child.
Yep. So okay. I have 2 older sisters, and so we all shared a room. And I remember this day that I was, hanging out on our floor playing with some toys or something like that. And I saw this gentleman, and I was like, well, who's that? And they were looking at me like, what are you talking about? I'm like, who's the guy that's standing by the door? And they started to freak out. And both sisters left me in the room by myself as they bolted downstairs. And I was like, wait a minute. And I was like, so I guess you're not seeing this person.
So you saw a man standing in the doorway when nobody else did.
Yeah. And he just, and I didn't realize at the time that he was kind of a little shadowy in a shape and a figure, but I could see his face. And so that's where, when I described it later, they of course were terrified and didn't want to go back into the room for a while. And eventually we got over it. But that was one of my first experiences where I realized, okay, not everybody is experiencing what I am.
Now, is this what some call shadow people?
That's a great question. So shadow people, I think there's a whole different gamut as to the types of individuals or beings that shadow people tend to be. Oftentimes what I have found when I have seen shadow people are usually spirits or, ghosts that are trying to manifest themselves, but can't quite get enough oomph to be able to fully manifest themselves to where, you could see somebody plain as day. Mm-hmm. So oftentimes it can be either our clairvoyant side isn't strong enough to see them in their full form, or they aren't strong enough to be able to develop themselves into their full form. But oftentimes when people take a look at what they think shadow figures are or shadow people, we're so used to thinking that anything shadowy is something that's negative or something that's challenging. So there's usually a little bit of a different connotation there.
So if one were to see the entity that you saw standing in the door was not scary, was not threatening, was not something that was bad.
Right. I think he was probably just curious as to what we were doing. Maybe when he had a body and when he had a life, he had children. So maybe he was just used to getting around that energy and just wanted to check out what we were doing. And I never saw him ever since.
So your siblings ran out of the room. I'm sure they told mom and dad. And they sat you down and talk to you about this? I mean, where did it go from there?
Right. So it pretty much, that's almost where it ended. So it was funny because I didn't even have any clue that my mom had any psychic abilities when I was younger. It's not like...
But she did.
Oh, she totally did. And it's not like we ever had these discussions. And so my sisters just kind of ran down, and I think my mom just kind of brushed it off as imagination and like, okay, you guys are playing some kind of a game, because obviously we played all kinds of stuff when we were younger. And just kind of dismissed it and, eventually, rinse and repeat, or, things just move on kind of type deal.
Do you still see people?
Not
entities, figures, whatever?
Not so much outside of myself, because my clairvoyance, now that I started to embrace it a little bit more, oftentimes it's going to play out in my mind's eye, where I'm going to be able to see it, or an image comes in, or I'll be able to have the impression of them. Sometimes they'll step into my space, which doesn't bother me either.
So you see them mentally versus physically? Kind
of, yeah. Okay. Instead of seeing them fully outside of myself, and I'll see that sometimes, but it's just not as much. Most of the time I'll ask them to do it in a way that I'm comfortable with, and I'm comfortable seeing them with my third eye in that form.
So you can actually communicate with them?
Yeah, we all do. We don't realize we do.
Okay, I don't realize that I do. How do I, if I'm not realizing it, communicate with those from the other side?
So a great way. So one of the ways I love explaining to people is when they have loved ones in spirit. Loved ones in spirit that they miss, that they want to connect with. One of the easiest ways that we can send what I call that bat signal out to them is thinking of them and just really tapping into the vibration of that loved one, and just thinking the fond thoughts. When we allow ourselves to be enveloped in grief, that's a little bit more challenge. It's more of a blocker to where they're not easily able to connect with us. But when we think about the loving, the higher vibrational energy, we think about how much we have a desire to connect with them. And you can even communicate out there. Hey, Dad, I haven't seen you in a long time. I really want you to step around and come into my space and let me know you're here. That's where we allow that open invitation for them to make some kind of a communication back with us. Sometimes you'll smell something. Sometimes you might feel them step into your space. Sometimes you'll have a really intense, vivid dream where you can touch and feel them and hug them as if they were here. So there's many different ways that they communicate backwards, but a lot of it is going to be telepathic. When it comes to having that desire, that wish, they have the ability to hear that, as well as if you verbalize it outside.
How do you know, I'm trying to word this properly so that I get my point across, psychic intuitive, root word being intuition, I guess. How do you know if something is truly somebody trying to communicate with you and just your mind running off on a tangent? How do you know the difference? Or is there a difference?
There's definitely a difference. At least in my experience, there's been a difference. Typically, when I'm tapping into my psychic intuitive side, if I put an intention out there, so let's use the same example of, trying to connect with a loved one. So typically when we have that kind of an experience, or we're putting that intention out there, we also have to have a certain level of a healthy detachment from it. So I put the signal out there like, hey, I'm dialing your number. I'm waiting to hear from you. but then we're not sitting by the phone waiting for the tiniest little thing and like, oh my gosh, I think that's it. I think that's him. You know, because then you're going to turn everything into being a sign or a form of communication. Instead, it's like hey, Dad, you know, I haven't heard from you in a long time. I know you're busy out there in spirit, but you need to pencil me in. And, you know, usually I'll ask for signs in threes because also we all have a human brain that we have to fight against.
What do you mean by signs in threes?
Signs in threes. So what I mean by that is there's like one of the call signs that I have with my dad is he used to call me Mousy when I was younger.
Okay.
So if I see, and thankfully I've never seen a mouse actually in my house, but sometimes I'll get some weird thing where somebody's car passes by and maybe the vanity plate says mouse on it. Or somebody will be like, do you remember that cartoon Mighty Mouse? Things that are just these like crazy serendipitous moments that you just can't make up.
Which and too frequent for a coincidence.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's why I asked for it in threes. The first time you flagged my attention. But I'm still going to be doubting it as to the same thing what you talked about. Is my brain just turning it into a sign or is it really happening?
And I asked that question because I can't tell you how many times I thought, man, I have an intuition about this. I know this is going to happen. I'm watching a ball game. Boy, I know Matt Carpenter's really going to hit this ball, and well, he just strikes out. So there's a big difference between just maybe wanting and hoping and then actually asking and having something come back and happen.
Excellent point. Correct. Okay. And that's where, again, for me, it's about putting the intention out there. Really establishing, hey, I want to have this connection, or I want to be able to connect with an individual or insight, and then you have to detach from it. So you give it the space for it to appear on its own. And that's the thing is when we're trying to grab for something or we have too much that we've invested in when it comes to that outcome or the experience, then that's where we don't step aside. Our ego gets involved or our human qualities will tend to get a little too, overlapping into the situation. So we have to allow that space for whatever to happen or the form that our spirit and loved ones want to connect with us to be able to choose and do it in their own way that they're most comfortable with as well.
So you're a young child, you freak your siblings out, and I'm guessing because Mom had the gift too, she sat you down and said, look, sweetheart, let me explain something to you.
Yeah.
Did that happen?
No, that didn't even happen until I was probably my first psychic experience with my mom. I was 9 years old.
That was 4 years in between.
Oh, yeah.
Did she just let it ride to see what was going on? Why didn't she talk to you?
So even in her childhood growing up, she was pretty terrified about her own gifts. She would see ghosts and spirits that would come to her. She didn't know what to do or say or, her culture being Filipino is pretty superstitious. So there's all kinds of different experiences that get involved there. And with it, I think she probably just thought, well, I don't need to talk to the kids about this because I don't want to terrify them. Especially if she was terrified for a long period of time. But when I was 9, there was actually a tragic life event that happened. I lost 3 very close loved ones. My best friend, her mom, and her sister all died in a plane crash. And so it happened obviously very suddenly. And I really retreated. I didn't understand grief. I didn't understand kids could die. And so I really wasn't handling it very well, as best as a 9-year-old can handle it.
Sure.
And Mom being concerned, that's the first time she came down and sought me out and, pulled out, believe it or not, her Pepsi cards. And she used
Pepsi cards.
Yeah, she could read regular playing cards like they were tarot cards.
Okay.
So we used to think she was playing solitaire.
But she wasn't.
No. The majority of the time she was probably doing readings on, things that were going on in our life. And in this instance, it was her concern about my well-being. And I was like, well, this is kind of a funny game. She started, shuffling the cards out and told me to make a wish on the deck. And I'm like, well, this isn't solitaire. And she started to communicate and explain things like, you're going to get $5 or a nickel. And I'm like, how does this make any sense? And I'm like, what kind of a game is this? Until she started crying and it was related to the wish that I had. I didn't even speak it out loud. But it was a wish that, started off the reading. And my wish, of course, was that I was able to say goodbye to my best friend who had, tragically died. And that's when it hit Mom. And then when she said it she said, you're not going to be able to have that goodbye that you wished for. And I looked at her, I'm like,
how did you know?
Right. I'm like, what is happening? what is this? And I was like, this is not solitaire.
Now, did she see that through the cards or through her own intuition?
Honestly, it was probably a combination of both, and that's a lot of how I operate too.